All right, in this video, I'm going to fix a Karcher electric pressure washer. Now, my kid picked this up off Facebook Marketplace and it worked for about a day. Ended up washing a car with it and maybe our back patio, and then it started acting up. So I've already taken the back off this thing, and I think this is a common problem with a lot of Karcher pressure washers. So how you get into the motor might differ. And what it's doing is it doesn't shut off. So the pump keeps running. Even if you're actually not engaging the pressure washer, the pump keeps going and going when in fact it should shut off. Also, there's an on-off switch. It doesn't work. So that's indicative of a switch problem inside of this little white plastic housing, which is the solenoid. So there's a bunch of hoses you need to remove. There was about 15 of those stupid little screws, and quite honestly, it was quite difficult to get into this thing. Looking at the manual for these, it doesn't appear that they are in fact something that you're actually supposed to open up and get into. But anyway, if you got a Torx bit screwdriver or something similar, you can take off the screws that hold the back together. I had to take the wheels off as well. And then I need a 6mm hex or Allen key. Not all of these Karchers are configured the same. There's a lot of videos on YouTube talking about this switch. But if you got a Karcher that stays running when it shouldn't stay running, or the on-off switch just doesn't work, this might be your problem. So it's all inside of that white plastic piece on the side, and it's just a little toggle switch that activates in two different ways. There's the switch on the front, which is the on-off switch that you use by hand, and then there's another switching mechanism that turns it off if the pressure builds up. So if you take your hand off the trigger, pressure builds up and it'll turn off the motor until you pull the trigger again, and then the motor will kick back on. So I need to pull off those 4 screws. Your model of pressure washer might be different. You might be able to get at the switch without pulling some of the other screws off, but I need these 4 screws off so I could lift that white piece of plastic that has the capacitor on it up and away from the pressure washer sort of motor housing. So 4 screws need to come out. And I don't take everything apart. I just need to be able to lift it enough so that I can get that white piece to clear a few pieces of metal that are kind of in the way for this. So once I've got those screws out, I get a little bit of play and I'm able to remove that piece of plastic. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you got those screws out of that component, there is some sort of gear oil in there. So don't tip it all the way over. I've got it a little tipped over and some oil or some grease kind of drips out. Not very much. You can see it on the floor, but definitely you want to avoid that. And there's a couple seals and stuff like that. Just make sure you're putting all the rubber gaskets and seals back where they came from and that none of them fall out. And one thing I'm going to do is remove that capacitor, that big black thing, and don't touch the contacts. Obviously, a capacitor does have the capacity to shock you. Now I need to separate the housing, and I do break one of these white plastic clips in the process. There it goes, but it's not a big deal. There's a whole bunch of them, and this thing's actually pretty tight. Overall, I would say the Karcher is a very well made pressure washer, except for this one switch. Everything's good except for this one switch, because it's like a light switch that turns on about 1,000,000 times every time you're using the pressure washer, sort of on off on off on off. Probably it gets a little bit of corrosion or some burn marks or whatever in there, or it's just overused. So the red thing is the switch in question, and you can see where my thumb is. When pressure builds in the pressure washer, it pushes that down and turns off the pressure washer. And you can see how that switch is also connected to the on-off switch that you can use by hand. So it's one single switch, but 2 ways to turn the pressure washer on and off. But because the switch is likely dirty or corroded or burnt out inside, it's not turning off. So it's just on all the time, cannot turn off. And that's the switch. Obviously, I can't work the switch properly because the top of that plastic housing is off. Anyway, to fix this, all I'm doing is taking some electrical parts cleaner and spraying it into that toggle switch. If I have another problem with this thing, maybe I'll buy a toggle switch online. They seem to have a bunch of them for sale, but I didn't know what kind of toggle switch was in this thing. It's difficult to find information on that. So I wanted to check this thing out anyway. And all I'm doing is taking that electrical parts cleaner, and because this toggle switch can't be pulled apart, or at least pulled apart easily, I'm just spraying it into the cracks, and there's a big hole on top, and I'm really just hosing it down as much as possible just to ensure that any deposits or corrosion, that kind of thing, is removed from the toggle switch. So I spray it down quite a bit, and I use quite a bit of the spray. Obviously I can't see in there, so I'm just trying to do as thorough of a job as possible. And then in between spraying it, I just use my hand to flick the switch on and off, plenty of times, lots of times. Spray it on off with the switch, spray it down again, and then work the switch. And I do dry everything now with some, I guess this is toilet paper, not even paper towel, but ultimately this stuff evaporates pretty quickly. So I would say by the time I reassemble everything anyway, the electrical parts cleaner would have evaporated. And once I'm bored of spraying the switch down, I'm just going to put the switch back in place. I lifted it up a little bit, so just make sure it's mounted correctly. I'll take the spring and reinsert it, and that's the spring that kind of is the counter to the on-off switch. And then I'll clip that little gray switch lever into place. So there's just 2 holes on each side of the white plastic housing that it clips into. Then I will depress that switch and I will insert the on-off switch. Pretty simple overall to do this. It is a pain to get into this pressure washer. There's just a lot of screws, and they're very stiff to remove. So easy job overall, but I found it to be quite annoying. And then I'll just take the top of this plastic housing and clip it into place. And there's lots of little snaps all the way around the side, so you need to engage them. But once you've got it lined up, you just squish it down and everything will clip in solidly. Now there's a couple electrical connectors that you may have to ensure are lined up properly, and then there's some indents on the white plastic housing where the pump motor has to line up as well while you're putting these screws in. But it's pretty self-explanatory, so just take those 4 screws and reinsert them and tighten them up. Again, obviously with the 6mm Allen key or hex. And then I believe off camera, I reinstall the capacitor, but it doesn't really matter what order you put it in. I would remove the capacitor while you're working on it. And then obviously I take it outside and test it. So that's pump running. Let go of the trigger and the pump shuts off. Squeeze the trigger, pump will kick on. And then I could work the switch so you can see the pump on and off. Turn it on, and then the pump motor kicks in. So like I said, what would happen before is you'd turn it on or off. It wouldn't matter, it would just keep running. And it wouldn't matter if you let go of the trigger, it would just be running all the time. So a pump that would never shut off obviously would probably burn out or cause damage to the pump, or you'd start blowing seals or that kind of thing. Now I do have a gas powered pressure washer that has a lot more power, but it is very loud and it almost has too much power to do smaller projects. So this $50 Karcher pressure washer that my kid got off Marketplace is actually maybe more useful, to be honest, than my gas powered pressure washer. And I kind of like it, so I'm going to try and keep it running. Hopefully it doesn't cause this problem again. Now that I've got a look at that switch, I may actually just buy the switch on Amazon and just have it on hand in case that issue comes back. So overall, I'm happy that this turned out well, and I was able to fix it for my kid who just bought this thing. Anyway, thanks for checking out my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.